Hey everyone, Jonas here. Thanks for joining us today for this session. Joining me today is Jessica Taylor, who leads all sorts of initiatives on the enterprise search side of things for our product marketing organization here at Elastic. And I myself lead the workplace search offering and initiatives here at Elastic. So super excited to have you here today. We thought we'd do a little something maybe a little different today. I think the topic is going to be more in the format of a listicle, if you're familiar with that language on the internet. But really what we're looking to achieve with you today is just to set the tone a little bit, maybe plant a seed, get you thinking about some things that you haven't been thinking about as far as content integrations in the context of search. Now we have a pretty decent agenda today, pretty packed agenda. So we're going to start by maybe just letting you know a little bit who we are and why you may want to trust us with this one and some of the informations and some of the tips that we have to share. We're also going to dive a little deeper into why data is important in the first place, why content is important. Sometimes we think about it as this, big pool of information without thinking too much how important it is. And Jessica has some really important stats and very interesting items that she'd like to share with us. And then last but not least, the whole team is going to join us to go over some of the tips that they have, share some of their expertise, and make sure that we can go over the 7 items that we think are most important as far as content ingestion in the context of search. So you might be wondering why why you should be trusting us with this kind of information. Well, it's pretty simple, right? With Elastic and Elasticsearch as a whole, we have really built a community of very, very expert, knowledgeable individuals who know a thing or two about bringing data from external platforms and bring them into a centralized environment, in this case here, Elasticsearch and some of the Elastic products, and really creating this relevant search experience for end users. And along the way, well, some mistakes are made, some lessons are learned. And I think that applies to our team as well. We have, for example, on the workplace search team, an entire team of professional engineers that think day in, day out about how to get data from the most popular platforms in the world into Elasticsearch and then be served for teams of all horizon, of all sizes, in a very relevant experience. So we want to make sure that we can share the good and the bad there, the things that we've learned along the way, and obviously the things that we're still learning today. So we've established 7 different items that we think are probably most relevant for you. The list is certainly not exhaustive. There's probably way more that we can share, but we want to keep it at a high level for today, so at least we can, maybe get that conversation started, or at least get you thinking about some of those items. It's not just about us, like I mentioned. There's also all about the community, right? We interface with a lot of people out there that are specialized in some, very niche use cases or some very, very complicated and very complex type of data scenarios. And we learn a lot from these folks. We learn a lot with how they approach these things. And hopefully we can share some of that knowledge back today. Now, before we get into that, I do want to turn it over to Jessica, who has done a ton of research and really trying to pull out a lot of information for you to put this conversation in context, understanding why data is so important, why we need to treat it so preciously. So Jessica, if you don't mind, I'd love to hear more about it.
We all know data quality is important, but let's pause just a moment to talk about why. Ever heard of the phrase garbage in, garbage out? The same principle applies to the data you search over. If you're setting out to create a great search experience, you have to be thoughtful about the data you index. Not so long ago, data was stored in one place, and data structure was dictated by that one application. So there was no issue with content sprawl nor misalignment on data quality. Those were the days of that mythical single source of truth that we're all just trying to get back to. And this was true for organizational search, for e-commerce platforms with a single product catalog, and knowledge bases with the central CMS. But we all know that this way of life had limitations because, after all, we're only as good as our data. So we needed more data inputs that we could create richer content and more powerful experiences with. And this is how a whole proliferation of collaboration tools and data sources entered the scene. Now users have loads of flexibility and can produce more content more effectively with purpose-built tools that are all opinionated about what content quality is and how it has to be represented at the technical level. And this means having to merge different product data sets, disparate website data, collaborative content, while still presenting a relevant and coherent content discovery experience for users. And this is where the headache comes in, because it's imperative to spend time carefully planning and executing on data integration to make all these tools play nicely together. Still, we know the payoff is huge because it results in magical and seamless user experiences. Now, it goes without saying that some of the data we consume is internally facing and some is externally facing. Did you know your colleagues spend nearly 2 hours looking for information every day? Whether it's onboarding or just trying to find the information you need to do your job, this is a problem we've all encountered in the workplace. And chances are, if you're an executive, only 3% of you have confidence in your team's data quality. And that leaves a huge opportunity for your team to do what they can to address it. It's a matter of economics too. 62% of US retailers have over 50 systems that store customer data and internal content. And that's why over half of organizations use at least one data connector to complement their search with a custom data data integration. But sadly, when it's not done right, there are real consequences to the bottom line. Over $3 trillion is lost every year to poor data quality. Look, it's not a matter of if you have to address data quality as you integrate with search, but when. Automating data deduplication at the time of indexing will cost you $1 per record. But if you want to wait and do it after you index, it's going to cost you $10 per record. And if you store content as is with duplicated, outdated records, it will end up costing you on the order of $100 per record. On average, organizations lose tens of millions of dollars each year due to poor data and content management practices. So the sooner in the process you plan to address data quality issues, the more cost effective it becomes, and it allows you to future-proof your technology investments. Okay, so maybe you're still thinking your data is already in a good place, especially if you're looking at it from the perspective of where it exists today. But remember that most issues crop up when the data changes context or when it changes hands. Let's take a couple examples from history. For example, Christopher Columbus, who sailed the ocean blue in 1492, was trying to find an alternate route to Asia from Spain. He relied on calculations by a Persian geographer to navigate his route, but neglected to convert Arabic miles to Roman miles and landed in the Americas rather than Asia. And some might argue that was a happy mistake. But here's another one. The Mars Climate Orbiter was launched in 1998 by NASA to study the Martian climate, and it was expected to deliver all sorts of scientific breakthroughs. But it flew off track and disintegrated in Mars's atmosphere because its software didn't convert its data to the metric system. It was a costly mistake on the order of nearly $200 million. So whenever you take data and you change its context, it can lead to really challenging situations. So it needs to be managed with a lot of foresight and care. Now back to Jonas, who's going to show you just how to do that.
Thanks, Jessica. That was super insightful. Particularly interesting to see the cost of less than optimal data for anyone's organization. And I think that that's something that will probably resonate with you. It certainly resonates with me. And I think that some of the items that we want to cover today actually will help at least address some of those things. So hopefully that's helpful. Now, I think what we have left to do now is just to dive in. So starting with number one, perhaps the most obvious of the bunch, but we like to start obvious and then build on top of that, is understand what the finish line is here for this particular initiative of yours. Understand what the end state is. Move on here as a product manager on the workplace search team, I think says it best. Always remind yourself of what the end state is and what that desired search experience is. It will help you make better decisions along the way. And so that means keeping in mind how things are going to be even displayed on a page, keeping in mind what kind of data will be made available for search. What are the things that you'll want to be able to filter on, for example? What are the things that might be not as useful, that you may not need to bring into your search index? Maybe there's a lot of metadata associated to, a product catalog. If you're interested in building e-commerce search, for example, that may not be relevant in the context of search. Do you want to pollute your search index with that information? Maybe you don't. But again, the only way that you know whether or not that information is relevant for the search experience that you're interested in building will be to understand what the end state of that is. So always keep that in mind as you're building your content integration. So again, first one, pretty obvious, but always good to keep in mind and remind ourselves of these things. What's number two? Well, I alluded to it just a second ago. Index the right amount. Now, right amount will change depending on the kind of search experience that you are looking to build and the stage at which you are currently in your process, right? But indexing the right amount, and therefore building for indexing the right amount, will simplify a little bit your process along the way. It will allow you to not have a ton of data pollution, for example. It will also allow you to maybe skip some of the development phases that may involve ingesting data that may seem relevant at first but may not be, right? So sometimes, depending on the platform, you'll have to jump through hoops to be able to pull down some types of data that may require, for example, transforms on the flies, or join, where you have to make multiple API calls to retrieve one bit of information and be able to resolve some entities and some identities and whatnot. And that's not particularly useful in all cases. So make your life a lot easier by being able to say, okay, I'm going to focus on just indexing the right amount for the stage that I'm in right now. So that may mean, like, let's start simple. Let's start with title, the body of a document, maybe a little bit of metadata, meta attribute around, for example, timestamps, created at, deleted at, updated at, some of these things that, are maybe a little more traditional as far as some of the various records that you're looking to ingest, and start there. Don't try to boil the ocean from day one. I think that's one of the mistakes that we've done most frequently, where we started far too large. The scope was far beyond what we were requiring from a relevance perspective and from an MVP sort of perspective. And I think that it is, it's weird to quote yourself here, obviously, but exercising restraint and adding some of that information iteratively is definitely something that's going to also help you identify maybe some relevance opportunities, right? Maybe you're going to start searching and you find yourself wanting to search over different things or filter over different things. And you have to give yourself that opportunity, that flexibility over time to be able to add things. And that also means that you need to keep that door open for building more things in the future. More on that in a second. Okay, number three. This third one is probably one of the questions we get most when we interface with people in the community, when we talk to customers and users, as to how to think about whether or not to push the data to a search index or let the search experience pull that data down from that third-party platform, right? And Marina here says it best. I think that push or pull, there's always going to be pros and cons to both, but you always have to remember that there are some downstreams implications to push or pull. It's not as simple as saying, hey, I pick one and it's going to end up being the same. That couldn't be further from the truth. This is one of the most important decisions that you'll have to make once you start thinking or designing or architecting a data source for whatever search experience that you're looking to build. So I thought maybe I'd just present like the two sides of the medal here and understand a little bit how they work and some of the advantages and disadvantages of both approaches. And then it becomes your responsibility as an integrator or as a builder to make that choice. So on the polling, crawling, pulling side of things, right, those are all almost synonymous in many ways. There's definitely a case for that. And some sources are actually very, very well suited for that. And not only the source itself, but the use case. And you'll understand why I make that distinction. So number one, if the content is readily available publicly, for example, a website, Having that information so readily available makes it much easier to just go and grab and pull it in many cases, right? It requires a lot less technical work, so to speak. It is a simpler setup. You'll often find also that there's a lot of tools that allow you to do that very quickly. So whether that's a web crawler or even on Workplace Search, for example, our data connectors are mostly pull based, which means that all you have to provide is some sort of authorization and authentication mechanism, and then the system can do most of the work for you, leveraging existing APIs without having to do a lot of development around existing application, for example. Now, one of the downsides of that is obviously the idea of data freshness and real-time search. And what do we mean by that? Obviously, if you're going to be pulling content down from a third-party system, you're always going to be accessing that data as a point-in-time sort of mechanism, right? So if you're pulling content down from, say, a Shopify website that you are crawling every 6 hours, you're only going to have the data that's available on that website every 6 hours. So if there are any changes in between those periods of time, you're not going to get access to that content. If you do the same thing for something like Google Drive, whatever changes happen between the first synchronization and the second one, 6 hours apart, that data is going to fall out of sync, quote unquote. Now, that's not always dramatic. I know that most of you, and when I talk to a lot of you, you are seeking the most real-time sort of dedication to real-time data, making sure that users can have access to the most freshest data and whatnot. And I think that's a great exciting goal to aim for, if that makes sense. But I don't know that's necessarily pertinent or even necessary in a lot of cases. For example, if you think about a knowledge base, right? The data updates on something like a knowledge base is relatively low frequency. And I think in most cases, content can be picked up. I know it's a matter of hours as far as, sort of like the gaps that you may have between your search experience and the actual data on your website. That's entirely reasonable. It also helps a little bit with sometimes load on the system because you're able to schedule some of those synchronizations. So this ability to schedule maybe on times where there's a little less traffic on your website, or maybe a little less strain on some of the servers that are Confluence server or Jira server that are high traffic environments during the business day, but not at night, then that gives you an opportunity to be able to ingest that data in a pull function. So go and retrieve it on a scheduled sort of manner. So that's for the case for pulling. Now the case for pushing or sending the data over to the search experience directly from the search experience, from the content platforms. Now, that gives you the most amount of control of all, right? Like that will give you absolute control as to when you send it, how you send it, the format that you want to send, because you can do all sorts of transformation before it even hits any sort of content processing unit, whatnot. It can all happen at your application level. So this is really, really well suited for maybe applications that you've built yourself or application layers that you might have built on top of databases within your organization, or serving product catalogs or whatnot. This is also very useful for applications that have things like webhooks that will issue events whenever something happens on the platform, and you're able to catch those and immediately store a document. And there you're going to have the benefit of real-timeness, and you won't have to reinvent the wheel and trying to integrate into all sorts of dark places of an application. So whenever you can, and if you have the technical capacity to do things that are a little more push-based, this can be very, very powerful as far as the freshness of the data. So for example, if one of the things that you want to be searching over is going to be, I don't know, like tweets or messages or things that really happen in real time, you don't really have the benefit of waiting 6 or 7 hours between syncs. So that's where obviously pushing to your search experience and building a connector or building a data integration that's going to push the data via API versus waiting and scheduling, sort of like a polling-based approach, is going to be probably most appropriate. But again, I think this one requires a little more technical know-how. The other thing too that you have to take in consideration is that if you have a business team that's responsible, for example, for merchandising or for addressing sort of content management and whatnot, a lot of times if they have access to something like pull-based, they can control a little more the way that the data is going to get ingested after the fact, or as a schedule and whatnot, and they like that approach. Versus if it's all push-based and API-based, then they will have to involve you, the integrator team, or development team to go and make changes. So it's not as necessarily as immediately flexible. It's very flexible conceptually speaking, but once it's deployed, changing it requires a little more technical know-how than your typical sort of polling, crawling type of use case. So something to keep in mind in the long run, right? And so that's why I think there's an argument for both. All right, that's a longer one, but it's a very important one for us to address. All right, moving on. Number 4, real-time indexing is not always the answer. I touched a little bit on that in the previous point, and we kept it as a separate point because we think it's such an important one. But Shenhui here really making it clear that real-time availability is not necessarily the holy grail for absolutely everything. Sometimes it's okay to keep that data a little bit out of sync, particularly if it's going to save you from having to deal with a lot of network traffic, for example. Maybe your data is not changing often. Maybe the data on the third-party platform is actually changing once every month, or it's changing once every week. And again, regardless of whether or not you're pushing or pulling or whatnot, setting that aside, the freshness of the data is something to consider as well in your content integration. So if you know that, for example, data changes a handful of times during the week, and you have a big dump of data on Sundays, for example. Now, for example, if you're doing the whole push approach, then on that big dump of data, you need to expect to be able to send all of that data all at once. So your data is not going to be real time necessarily, but you have to follow what the third-party platform is giving you. Whereas if you've chosen the route of pulling, then you can probably just organize your scheduling around that. And so you don't have to schedule syncs every 6 hours if you know that ultimately that data gets updated once a week. So you have to be smart about when you run those what we call synchronization jobs, right? Whether it's a cron job or a schedule, however you decide to build that. But I think it's very important to remember that you have to follow ultimately the update and freshness of the data itself, and also the expectation of the end users. We touched a little bit on that in the previous point, but if you're ingesting tweets, for example, users, when they search for tweets, they expect that real-time nature, right? It's a very conversational type of use case, and therefore people expect that real-time nature. But when it comes to like I said, knowledge bases, or even maybe like e-commerce sites in many ways, or other aspects of Google Drive and Confluence Server and whatnot, that real-time nature is definitely nice to have, but it's not always the most important thing to consider. All right, now going into number 5, indexing incrementally. And Irina here is really sort of taking that very smart approach of saying, start small and iterate. And you'll remember in one of the very first points, I mentioned that we'd touch a little more on the iteration process as far as data. We talked about it from the data perspective. So start small, don't necessarily index every single field, every single object on the platform, and then go from there. And I think it takes even more sense as you start thinking about search experiences as a whole. So you can think about data sources individually, but you also have to think about data sources in the greater context. So what does it mean to have multiple content sources live next to one another? So to be able to plan out that idea that you're going to start with one source or two sources that live within the same search experience, and then add more over time, and make sure that you can sort of leave yourself some of that flexibility with the initial data sources for them to also evolve as you start pulling more and more content sources. So when you're designing your data integration, give yourself an opportunity to modify its design, to augment it over time, build it modularly. Maybe you're going to be able to reuse some of the things that you've built in the first place. Maybe you're going to be able to build it into more of a framework. This is something I can talk to very confidently, because when we started working on something like workplace search, we started working on data connectors like Google Drive and Box and Dropbox and some of those data connectors as sort of snowflakes. They were, individually built. They had their own logic. They were very powerful, on their own. But once we started running them in parallel to one another, we realized that, number one, there was a lot of similarities in some of the things that they weren't doing. And number two, they weren't necessarily playing along all that well, because they had sort of competing ideas, and obviously like different people work on different things, and then suddenly you end up with different ideas. So one of the things that we've realized is, If you have one or two data sources, don't go and invest on an entire connector framework, necessarily data ingestion framework, if you can get away with it. But if you know that you're going to be building a system over time, allow yourself for some of that flexibility. That's not to say start with a big framework and then start building data integrations on top of it, but rather keep it in mind as you're building your first data integrations and allow yourselves for some of that flexibility, right? So start small. Make sure that you can ingest data effectively, efficiently at first, but also give yourself some room as far as that framework is related, and making sure that you can not only augment the number of data integrations that you can bring into the fold and how they're going to work and operate and whatnot, but also individual sort of connectors, like their objects themselves. Like, is there that third-party source that you might be connecting to, are they going to add additional objects in the future? If you're working for Salesforce, for example, right now you may be ingesting opportunities, leads, and whatnot, but what if Salesforce add another object tomorrow morning that you're interested in adding into the search experience and delivering relevant search experience to end users? Well, you have to give yourselves that flexibility. So build with simplicity in mind, but also with flexibility, and give yourself that opportunity to expand in the future. Number 6, and that one is an interesting one, and we're gonna toot our own horns a little bit here as far as workplace search and some of the things that we do here at Elastic, but again applies across multiple use cases beyond workplace search, and that is, don't reinvent the wheel if you don't have to, right? Like, use existing code. Ioana, who's the tech lead for the workplace search product, frames it, I think, very, very well when she talks about using connectors and data libraries and open source software and code examples and tutorials and Stack Overflow and some of these things. Just be smart about how you approach this. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes it's tempting to say, hey, I know my platform's best. I know this language really well. I'm just going to invest in that. And the reality is, as a team that's been building a lot of data integrations for a very long time now, every content integration end up being a bit of a relearning experience, if that makes sense. And there are people in this world that are a lot smarter and brighter than you in some specialization, right? This is perhaps a humbling moment for all of us, but some people specialize in some data sources and will be very good at building and maintaining those data integrations better than you ever would. So it's always a good idea to maybe look out and see if you can leverage other people's work. Legally, obviously, if it's open source software. If you have to license some of the software for your own offering, you get to do that as well. But I think what's important here is not limiting yourselves and thinking like, oh, I'm gonna have to start from scratch. Nothing out there exists. Well, even if it's small things like using a third-party source's API clients, right? Sometimes we even forget to do that. Sometimes we'll just start issuing curl commands from our, stack, and then next thing you know, you end up building something that you could have done maybe more rapidly with an API client, or existing connectors in the market. There's a ton of companies, Elastic's included, that will build those data connectors for you, right? And so maybe at first it will not do everything that you're expecting it to do. Maybe there are some small things. Maybe there's a 10% of things that you'd like to modify because it doesn't exactly meet your requirements, but you have to look at the much bigger picture. And I think this is one of the mistakes that we see occur most often right now, is that people go for that 100% experience. Goes back to a couple of points that we made earlier, obviously, but forget to look at some of the complexities of maintaining a data integration over time. APIs change, for example, or even just like the simple things as adding new things as they are added to third-party platforms, and modifying some of those things and updating dependencies and some of these things. So I think it's probably important that you give yourself that opportunity to use software that has already been built and is well maintained. If you trust the communities and if you trust the maintainers of the projects that you use, do your vetting. Make sure that a project isn't stale, it doesn't have any momentum behind it. That's always a problem, obviously. But do allow yourself and do some research as far as understanding whether or not integrations already exist, or if there's tooling around those integrations that you can use. And number 7, last but not least, and perhaps one that you may not be thinking about a lot, but we think a lot about, and that's been one of the biggest learning moments for us as a team, is make sure that you test your data integrations in some sort of automated way as early as possible. It will save you from so many headaches along the way. And Sean, who's someone who's been working on a lot of those automation / data integration automation type of initiatives recently. I'd like to think that he's one of the experts in the field right now in that particular area. Says it really, really well, is automate everything, especially at scale. If you can build data integrations that test for more than just 1 or 2 document ingestion, you will find yourself in a position where you're going to be catching bugs or API deprecations that you may have missed, or changes in the way data is formatted much earlier, without having necessarily to rely on your end users to raise a flag or support cases coming through your customer support portal because suddenly your search doesn't work or it's entirely broken and whatnot. So having those tests, I think it's just good, obviously best practices for software development in general, but particularly in the context of taking data from one place and moving it to another one is extremely important. So do not cut that corner. I think sometimes, we're working on a time crunch and we have to cut some corners. That is not one that is particularly smart to cut. It has saved us from so many bugs over time. And to be able to test at scale is when you're going to start caching things over, for example, I don't know, like you start indexing 10,000 documents from a particular platform that you're interested in, and turns out the database that you're hitting to retrieve those documents start filling at 10,001. If you've just tested it with 5 documents, well, you're never going to catch that, right? But you're going to find a lot of weird behavior in your data in production, and you're going to be wondering why. So to be able to test at scale, not only test frequently, but testing at scale is going to help you catch a lot of those things early, and you're going to make your end users you're going to make their lives just that much easier because you went through that effort. And I'll tell you from experience that I think it might be hard to justify that time spent on the automation early on, but it is something that will make a huge difference. And this is something also that, unfortunately we don't have the data points here, but I am almost certain that we can quantify the same way we can quantify data quality and data duplication as Jessica presented in the first section of this presentation when she talked about $10, $100, for the cost of moving data around. It's the same with automation. If you're able to catch a bug early, you're going to save yourself from a lot of headaches and ultimately for your company a lot of money. And I think that if you want to think about this from a commercial standpoint, from a more like business corporate standpoint, that's probably a good argument to make. And that's it. We know that was really high level, and hopefully, we trust that there's a lot of bright people watching this right now, and maybe it was just one of them that stood out to you, and you knew all about the 6 other ones, and maybe you want to know more about one of them. Please do reach out. We're here to answer some questions. Maybe you don't agree with one of them. If you don't agree with one of them, reach out. We'd love to have that conversation. We'd love to have those chats with you folks. This is what the Elastic community is all about. And if you've never tried any of our search products here at Elastic, whether that's Elasticsearch or the entirety of the enterprise search solution across app search, workplace search, and some other of our products that really focus on information retrieval and delivering search for audiences, please do check them out and go on Elastic Cloud, 14-day trial, super easy to get started. And really you'll see we have a bunch of data integrations that you can even pull inspiration from if you want, if you spin up the workplace search product and want to play around with it. So anyways, it's good having you here. If you have any questions, please do reach out. Thank you.